Now available in paperback and Kindle Unlimited. ISIS, Escape from Transylvania. The Goddess Next Door and John Haynes must escape a horde of vampires on the hunt in this horror-filled ISIS series adventure. Get ISIS, Escape from Transylvania in paperback and Kindle Unlimited today. Last Friday night, I saw something on social media that disgusted me as a comic fan, disgusted me as a publisher, and disgusted me as an American citizen. And I had just gotten through making my appearance on the Obsidian radio show, and I decided to go over to social media to do some late night book promotion. And as I was posting up links to one of my ISIS series books, I noticed that there were some posts from Richard C. Meyer, also known as Diversity in Comics. And in those posts, he was upset about the fact that Antarctic Press decided not to publish and distribute his graphic novel, Jawbreakers Lost Souls. Now, Richard C. Meyer, or Diversity in Comics, over the last couple of months, has been making a lot of efforts to raise funds to get Jawbreakers Lost Souls published, and he's raised almost $250,000 towards that effort. And what Richard C. Meyer is doing is showing that there is still an interest in comics from many people out here, and showing that there's still passion for great comics out here. And his whole thing with Jawbreakers Lost Souls was an effort to try to help an ailing comic book industry, an industry that has been in a slump for over 25 years and is now in a stage of crisis, because all one has to do is look at the Comic-Con numbers and see how anemic comic book sales are, especially when you compare those sales to the period of the 1997 collapse, where many books were still selling in the hundreds of thousands, or even before in the early 90s and late 80s, when books were selling in the millions of numbers. And Richard C. Meyer is very passionate about comics. He wants to see this industry grow. He wants to see this industry thrive. And Jawbreakers Lost Souls looks like it was going to be a book that would have really gotten a lot of people who were sitting on the sidelines back into comics. However, we had Mark Waid decide to use his influence and clout to contact Antarctic Press and have this book killed from getting onto bookstore shelves, because Antarctic Press decided they didn't want to publish Jawbreakers Lost Souls due to Mark Waid's using his influence and clout to get the project killed. And that's what disgusted me as a publisher, because it showed me that Antarctic Press, they have no backbone and no integrity. And the reason why they have no backbone and no integrity is because they're going to allow someone like Mark Waid to influence what type of publications get published by their imprint. As a publisher myself, that shows me that this publisher really does not have much courage to stand by a creator. Now, as a publisher myself, I understand that if I take a project on, I have to stand by my publisher, my writers, and I have to stand by my artist. And if I make a commitment to publish their projects, I have to stand by the work that I decide to commit to publish. When I decided to publish my friend Lawrence Cherry and his Christian fiction, Commencement, I made a commitment to stand by that book and stand by what was put in that book from cover to cover. And as he published School of Hard Knocks and Atonement, I still stood by Lawrence Cherry. And that's the type of support a publisher is supposed to give creative people like Richard C. Meyer and John Malin when they make a commitment to them to publish their work. Unfortunately, this publisher, Antarctic Press, showed me they had the spine of a jellyfish by backing out of clearly a deal that was going to make them lots of money, and a deal that would have helped them really help revive a struggling comic book industry. They would rather cave to the pressure of people like Mark Waid and many of these comic shop owners who just don't or disagree with Richard C. Meyer and John Malin, rather than try to make efforts to take action to constructively give customers, one, what they want, and make efforts to try to save a dying comic book industry. Because I look at what diversity in comics is trying to do with Jawbreakers, and it's the exact same thing I would try to do if I had the funds to go out here and make an ISIS series graphic novel, which is something I plan to do in the next few years if I can get enough money to do it. And when I look at the way they have treated Richard C. Meyer, again, it's really reprehensible to me how these comic shops have treated him and how Antarctic Press has treated him. A man who is just making efforts to try to save a hobby that is on the brink of collapse. Because what he was trying to do with Jawbreakers Lost Souls was he was trying to save a dying industry by offering a product that he believed the audience wanted. And the audience, as I see it, clearly responded by offering lots of money all over the world. I mean, for him to raise $250,000 in less than 30 days shows us that there was an audience for this product, and many comic shops foolishly wound up shooting themselves in the foot by putting their own personal politics ahead of business. And as a publisher, I put business first because I understand in order to stay in business, I need money in order to keep being able to go out here and publish more titles, pay more artists for covers, and get books out here. And if I understand this on a print-on-demand level that's being run from a laptop, I would wonder and think that comic shops should understand this with their overhead. I mean, it's in the publishing business, it's like this. The 10% of the books that sell pay for the 90% that don't sell. And it's the Jawbreakers Lost Souls that wind up covering the losses for books like Kamala Khan, Ms. Marvel, Riri Williams, Iron Man, Squirrel Girl, and many of the SJW books that many of these liberals want to continue to push, but continue to sell anemically at the comic shop. And I look at this diversity in comics, and people don't see what type of impact this man is having on the industry. He's trying to help an ailing industry, but it seems like many in the industry are so caught up in their emotions and their politics that they can't take the life preserver this man is trying to throw to this industry. No, instead of taking the life preserver and trying to get pulled to safety, they would rather put a knife in the life preserver and rather see the industry drown. And they would rather see the industry drown because they are too emotional about their political beliefs regarding things like Donald Trump's presidency to be concerned about the long-term health of the comic book industry. As someone who's been a fan of comics for over 35 years, and as someone who understands the business of publishing and has been in the business of publishing for close to a decade, I can look at the efforts of Richard C. Meyer and see them as something very positive as related to this comic book industry. Jawbreakers Lost Souls was looking like the book that could have been the Fantastic Four #1 for many comic shops, and the book that could have helped many new readers come into comic shops. Unfortunately, because we have a cabal of SJWs and people who have these crazy far-left political beliefs, they want to rather be right than try to right what is wrong in the comic book industry. And they would rather see the comic book industry collapse due to their own personal beliefs than go out here and do what is right for their customers. They would rather sit there and stock books that sell poorly like America Chavez, Squirrel Girl, Riri Williams, Iron Man, and many other poor-selling books than stock a book that is got an audience and is building buzz and is generating a following. And from what I'm seeing in the comic panels, a very solidly told book as related to story, because the pictures in a comic usually are really solid due to the writing, and it looks like Richard C. Meyer is a very solid writer from what I've seen there, and with John Malin's art, it's very solid as well. So this book, it looks very solid from my perspective, and something that people should support and want to support. And the only thing that's really keeping it out of comic shops is this group of people like Mark Waid and many of these SJWs who are a part of the Portland Mafia who want to try to keep quality comics out of comic shops. And again, I look at that and that collusion that went on with these comic shops and Mark Waid and what he did with Antarctic Press, and it's just reprehensible because here we have a group of people in this United States of America deciding that they're going to decide what it goes on a comic book store shelf, and they're going to decide this with someone who served in our U.S. military. I mean, Diversity in Comics is a man who served in our U.S. military and fought for our country. And I would think that you would decide, anyone who was out here would make an effort to put the work of a veteran on their shelves, because this man fought for our Constitution. And what's really sad is we have a group of people who decide that they are higher and better than our Constitution, and they're going to go out of their way to censor someone who fought for our country and fought for our Constitution and fought for our First Amendment rights, and they're going to decide to censor that person. And for this to go on in the comic book industry again, this is what really disgusts me as an American citizen, because this man, again, fought for our country, fought for our Constitution, and we have American citizens like Mark Waid and many of these SJWs who own these comic shops, making efforts to keep his book off the shelf, making efforts to suppress free speech in the United States of America. And that really disgusts me as an American citizen, and it also disgusts me as a publisher. And to see Antarctic Press back out of this deal is really sad to me, because as a publisher, you have to really stand up for free speech. I mean, if you're an independent comic publisher, you come into this business because you really want to make a statement about things. When I look at Jawbreakers, it was a book that was going to make a statement about things as related to the comic book industry, and it was going to make a statement that refuted the narrative of many of these SJWs out here who wanted to make a statement that people wanted diversity, but when it was clear to me from the sales, people did not want their brand of diversity, because their brand of diversity, as I see it as an African American publisher, is actually nothing more than breathing brand new life into stereotypes. And the entire group of books that were promoting this so-called diversity, they smacked of so much paternalism, it just wasn't funny. So when I look at those SJW comic books, they clearly weren't what the audience wanted, and they promoted the worst ideas about minorities and promoted stereotypes I have not seen in a comic book since Different Strokes. And when I look at Diversity in Comics and what he was trying to do, he was giving us an actual great comic book with no identity politics, a lot of action and adventure, and exactly what the customer wanted. But this group of people, they would rather collude to keep this great product off the shelf of comic shops that desperately need a great product, because last year we had over 50 comic stores close, and they closed due to the fact that we had so much terrible product being published by publishers like Marvel and DC, comics that promoted identity politics that no one wants to read in their comics. And again, when it comes down to the comic book industry, they need all the help they can get at this point. So anyone producing a quality comic out here, you would think you would make an effort to go out and support, because that person is going to bring foot traffic into your stores, that person is going to bring money into your till, and their person is going to allow you to keep the lights on in your shop. Because again, as someone who has worked in publishing for 10 years now and has studied it for over 20 and aspired to be a comic book writer, I look at this insanity and it makes me shake my head, because as a guy who has been publishing books for years, again, I know that it's the 10% of books that sell that pay for the 90. And all those books that are in comic shops that are non-returnable, that aren't selling, those are the books that usually lead to that shop closing eventually, because those books just don't move. So you desperately need a book like Jawbreakers to help you be able to keep the lights on and to keep that book out of your store because you don't agree with the politics of the creator. That's completely insane as I see it. As a writer and a publisher, I really don't care who goes out here and buys my SJS Direct books. And I've had people who are white supremacists buy my books. I've had feminists buy my books. And I don't care who buys the books. As long as I have readers buying the books and sharing the books, their politics and their political beliefs don't matter to me. And when I look at this comic book industry and I see the state that it's in, it really makes me shake my head because as someone who wanted to be a part of this industry, I look at all of this dysfunction going on, and for some cases and some days I sit there and say to myself, I'm glad I'm a part of self-publishing and trade publishing and not the comic book industry, because if I had to deal with this insanity, I would just have to walk away from the table. Because sit there and say, you don't want to stock a book because the person's political beliefs are something you disagree with, that's completely insane to me. And the same people who would sit there and censor Richard C. Meyer and John Malin, I have to wonder, would they censor Shawn James if he came out here with an ISIS series graphic novel? Because that's the slippery slope we're on right now. First, it's Richard C. Meyer and John Malin, and then it's Shawn James and whoever he decides to go out here and pencil an ISIS graphic novel. And because my political beliefs don't fall in line with these liberals out here, they're going to say, oh, we don't want to publish, we don't want to, like a publisher like Antarctic Press will say, we don't want to publish an ISIS graphic novel, or comic shops will say, we don't want to stock an ISIS graphic novel. And that's all because of the political beliefs I have. And that's completely insane. A great story that has an audience is something every comic shop owner should want to have on their shelves because you want to have more customers. That's business 101. But when I look at this comic book industry, it seems like we have an elite group of people like Mark Waid and many of these SJWs who want to turn comics into a fiefdom, not understanding that publishing is a very fragile business, and if you cannot get people into the store to buy product, you're not going to be in business for long. And when I look at the state of the comic book industry and the way they treated diversity in comics, I see an industry that is going to be on the brink of collapse sooner rather than later, because when you try to keep quality products off the shelf and continue to promote bad products, then you're not going to be in business for much longer. And when I look at this whole big picture, and I see guys like Mark Waid going out here to try to bully people like Antarctic Press, they are literally sending the industry on the brink of a 1950s collapse, a collapse which cost hundreds of people their jobs and led to many people winding up becoming depressed, alcoholics, drug addicts, and extremely miserable because there was next to no comic book industry because there were a lot of publishers had to shut down. And the reason why those publishers shut down back then was, again, due to the McCarthy hearings, but this is even going to be worse than that because if we don't have anybody buying comics and no one having a reason to buy comics, then it may be next to impossible to revive the comic book industry at that point. Because when I look at that state of affairs, I have to wonder who's going to hire Mark Waid when he led to the complete collapse of the comic book industry by keeping a quality product like Jawbreakers Lost Souls off the shelves. Because I look at his actions and they clearly show me a man who does not understand the comic book industry, the dire straits of the comic book industry, or someone who even understands the First Amendment of the United States Constitution of this United States of America. And what's really sad about Mark Waid is that this was a guy who I enjoyed his Flash run, and I enjoyed the greatest Flash story as I see it, Return of Barry Allen and Kingdom Come. But when I look at this man and I look at his behavior, he shows me none of the heroics that he presented in those great comic book stories. If you'd like to try some of my SJS Direct publications like the ISIS series, the E-Steam series, The Temptation of John Haynes and the Smith-Torello trilogy, you may do so by clicking the link to Amazon.com. And if you want to help me make more videos like this, you can donate to my Patreon by clicking the link in the description box. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.